March 16th to apply, so visit bbb-scholarship.org for all the details.
Whether you're shopping for your first home, need something bigger, or downsizing for retirement, you need a mortgage. Talk to the experts at Farmers State Bank or start the application process online at farmersebank.com. Our mortgage lenders have many options to help you into the home of your dreams, from conventional to in-house, VA, rural development, and more. Farmers State Bank, your Montana bank since 1907, an equal housing lender and member FDIC.
Red's Bar has long been one of Missoula's favorite establishments. With a warm and inviting atmosphere, it's the perfect place to sit and relax during the cold months to take in the NBA, NHL, or college basketball game of your choice. Now, Red's Bar has all the Montana games as the men's basketball team chases another NCAA tournament appearance. And of course, there's no better place to watch all the madness unfold, no matter who your team is. Red's Bar, a place to watch sports and make friends at 217 Ryman downtown. Red's Bar, a Missoula institution.
Warmer days are ahead, and if you want to have the best summer yet, you need your car looking fresh and your boat better have the tunes ready to bump on the lake. Aspen Sound is your go-to spot, whether you need the windows tinted, you need to upgrade your music system on your boat, or you need a new sound system in your car. And this March, Aspen Sound is teaming with Tutelo Nuanez for an NCAA Tournament Bracket Challenge. Aspen Sound will be giving away $500 worth of prizes, including a $250 prize to first place. Tune in to Tutelo Nuanez weekdays from 4 to 6 p.m. Enter the ESPN Bracket Challenge, presented in part by Aspen Sound.
Dr. Hardy from NWPSA is here with me. Dr. Hardy, it seems like every day there is some new therapy or procedure for folks looking to improve their confidence and appearance. What is your process for choosing what you will offer your patients?
One of the most important things to remember about plastic surgery and skin therapies is that the latest isn't always the greatest. In our practice, we let science and safety speak, so we educate ourselves on every new technology and procedure and only bring in what we feel can give safe and effective results to our patients.
Well, that's what it's all about. How does a patient go about choosing what is right for their needs?
Each patient will have an extensive consultation where we discuss their short and long-term goals. Patients can feel secure in knowing that we have the experience to guide them to the treatments that will be the most effective in helping them reach these goals in a safe and confidential environment.
Contact Northwest Plastic Surgery Associates, nwpsa.com, or call 728-3811.
ESPN Radio for Western Montana, KKVU HD3 Stevensville, and 102.9 FM on K275BS Missoula. It's 4 o'clock. Welcome to Tutelo Nuanez, Montana's only statewide sports talk show. Broadcast on 102.9 ESPN Radio for Western Montana and across the state on SWX Television. I like football! Now, sports talk from Montana for Montana. Live from the Kurtz Polaris studio, here is Ryan Tutel and Colter Nuanez.
Hello, Montana. Well, every sporting event in America has been canceled, including the Big Sky Conference men's and women's basketball tournament. Hi, how are you? Ryan Tutel, Go to Nuanez, 102.9 ESPN. Happy to be on the radio with you. I'll tell you what, it took a little work today to get us out there. Our voices, our dulcet tones on the radio across Western Montana and across the state on SWX Montana Television. But we made it happen, and we are certainly happy to be there with you. If you would like to listen live and you are outside the range of your radios, you can get onto the World Wide Web. I think that thing is still turned on. 1029ESPN.com. You go listen live on the Listen Live tab. It is available all the time, thanks to Opportunity Bank, your local bank, your opportunity. Also, the phone lines, 329-1899. All guests join us via the Rankage Brothers RV phone line. We have been in a whirlwind in Boise, Idaho, since Colter got here on Sunday. I arrived yesterday, and we had some good basketball games the first couple of days of the tournament, and then everything just got shut down like that in the snap of a finger, and it was seemingly one conference, one president following another over and over, in terms of what was going on nationwide, and the Big Sky certainly followed suit, so we will get into that. We also are going to have some sound for you from Leon Costello. He was the one official that was able to go on the record and talk about kind of the experience of this and where he's at as the athletic director of Montana State. We also will have Sean Rainey in with us. I mean, he's not doing anything. He might as well come talk to us on the radio. So Sean Rainey, obviously from SWX Television, the sports anchor there, our buddy Sean, going to be in here with us as well. And who knows, we might even get a shout-out, a welcome in from Brooks Duanas here on this show as well. I know he's got plenty of thoughts on what has gone down in the last 24 hours. But, Colter, we sit here, and you and I went to bed last night knowing that there was a bunch of tenuous, situations and a couple of conference tournaments had already been closed when we went to bed yesterday. But we talked to Tom Wistrcill directly yesterday and asked him, kind of where are we at? And he was pretty optimistic and felt like, unless the governor of Idaho says, no, we want to go forward with this thing. But then they just started dropping like flies. The Big Ten, the SEC this morning, everybody closes down. And then the Big Sky Conference follows suit. We found out about 11 this morning, an hour ahead of what would have been the tip of the first game of the men's quarterfinal, that there was going to be no basketball tournament in Boise any longer, and that it was done. See you later, sayonara. In fact, even so much so that we didn't even get to go back into the arena to do our show. We're sitting here talking to the people on the phone line because we were not able to connect in the location that we had been prepared for, and so now here we are. But we do it nonetheless, Colton. We play with everybody shuts down, we stay open. You know what I mean, man? That's what we're here to do.
What an interesting day. Definitely probably the most catastrophic sports day of our careers. Yeah, no doubt. Caution is always the answer when it comes to things like this, when it comes to pandemics. And sometimes the specifics don't really matter. And so, on one hand, I'm heartbroken for the kids that were supposed to play in this tournament. Selfishly, I'm really disappointed for us. I mean, this is absolutely my favorite event the entire year. I basically live all year long for this event. I was so excited for today. To watch Harold Frey, 4 basketball games back-to-back. Yeah, I mean, I was so stoked to watch Harold Frey in Holland Woods. I was so stoked to watch Saeed Pridgett. I was so stoked to watch all of it, all the action. And the abrupt ending to this, especially for, you look at the women's side, Montana State took care of business last night. They move on against Northern Arizona in the championship game. One step away. They need one more win to set the all-time school record for victories in a single season. If they do that, they're going to take a 27-6 record into the NCAA tournament and an 18-game winning streak. Yeah, I talked to one senior-level administrator who is the head female administrator at the Big Sky Conference, and she mentioned that they were really going to push for Montana State to get a 10 or 11 seed, and with the RPI that they had, although they didn't have that premier non-conference win, the fact they played so well, Texas A&M, Gonzaga, and they played so well for so long that they were optimistic that Montana State could get a 10, 11, 12, whatever it might have been, but definitely we could have gotten them a draw as a winnable NCAA tournament game, and now it's just over. It's over for all those seniors. So on one hand, they'll have one of the great winning streaks of the entire season across the country in college basketball. There's no way for it to end. They ended their season on a win, which almost certainly would not have been the case if they would have made the NCAA tournament, but incredibly disappointing that they do not get to experience that. Well, there's a difference when you end your season on a win knowing it's the last game you're playing in, and when you end your season on a win looking forward to the next game that just never shows up. No doubt. And so I'm very disappointed that this thing got canceled, but I'm also 0% surprised. When I woke up this morning, the first 2 news alerts I saw were the Big Ten and the SEC canceling, and then the Pac-12, and then all of a sudden it's just dominoes. And so, I mean, it's the safe decision, it's the smart decision. At the end of the day, if you're the Big Sky, you have to make the decision as much for a publicity and marketing and this conference reputation reason as you do for the actual health of the people participating in the tournament. Part of this is about just the hysteria that has spread across the country about this pandemic, but also part of it is just about the image of your league. If everybody else in the country cancels and you don't, you certainly stand out, but I don't think you stand out for the right reasons, just because I think that there would be so much scrutiny then laid upon your league. And even though Idaho, Montana, 2 of the only inland states without any sort of COVID-19 exposure yet, it's still... I think you can't do it. Their hands were tied. I don't think that Tom Wistrcill really had a say in this, Leon Costello told us, ironically, the presidents from the Big Sky Conference were here. They came here to have their meeting, their quarterly meeting in Boise. That's on the books for months. But the number one point of agenda, the number one agenda point was, what are we going to do? And then they all decided we can't do it. Well, there's a bunch of things in there, Colton, that I want to sort of parse out. First of all, it sounds to me, and we're still trying to get information on this, but primarily that this decision, like in terms of who's making the decision, it's the presidents who came together and ultimately said that they should do this. Now, certainly there would be input from the commissioner's office, from the conference itself, and there's an open conversation and dialogue about what the best thing is to do and why. Here's how I want to push back, though. When you said, look, the Big Ten says they're out, the SEC says they're out. Well, you can't be the one and only conference in America that's carrying on with a basketball tournament when everybody else has basically shut the thing down. On one hand, I completely understand what you're saying and the amount of scrutiny that would have been on the Big Sky Conference if they would have continued to play today, and we're playing right now, where the only games on right now would have been significant. And I think there would have obviously been so much backlash from who knows where of people, saying that they're reckless and that they're, poorly led and whatsoever, that sort of thing. I also think, though, this feels to me that there's been a whole bunch of follow the leader, and I don't know who the leader is. This is like a whole bunch of conferences and presidents. In this case, the leader in this entire global situation is the media. No. Just all right. But what I'm saying to you is that it is the NCAA, does the thing where they're not going to have fans initially on their deal, and then it's just the next one and the next one and the next one. And my issue isn't even so much that they're shutting all this stuff down, is that I haven't seen anywhere where somebody has gotten a top-level CDC, a spokesperson, a scientist, a medical individual to go, this is the reason, this is the way this thing works. Look, I understand broadly when you talk about the pandemic, and I've seen some of the figures of, what's it, COVID-19, of how quickly and easily it can spread. It spreads, much faster than the normal, influenza virus in terms of how many people can generally infect, how many other people once they've gotten it. I understand that there's no vaccine, and that the bottom line on this whole thing is you're trying to flatten out the curve, if I can borrow Jay Bill's great line, and he's absolutely right about that. You're trying to make sure that you are as in front of something like this as it can possibly be, because it's true. If this absolutely exploded into something that a lot of people had, right, like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, it's a crisis of absolutely epic proportions, and that is not a scenario that you want to ever look back and go, well, we should have done this. We should have not played the basketball games. So if that were to eventuate or could have eventuated, I completely understand this and am with it. My issue is that I haven't heard yet from anybody that I would have any level of credence hearing from about the specifics of what I'm talking about how this virus is passing, the growth of it over time, and what the expectation would be if games were still to be played, if the conference tournaments were still to be played. And so my issue is that it feels like choices are being made not on the evidence, not on what the realities are of the number of people that have it and all of that kind of thing, but actually just on the fact that other conferences did this, so now we got to do this.
I think you have to be safe like this because there's no reliable testing for just common people at this moment, right?
I mean, there is, but there's not enough, right? Yeah.
But we don't have the ability to test every single person that's going to come into the arena, so you never know when someone might have the virus, right?
Yeah.
And there's a report that potentially at the Colonial Athletic Association tournament, that an official had symptoms of the coronavirus and potentially had the coronavirus.
Yeah.
Well, so then that's even just one official that's exposing people. I mean, that's where the whole concept of Agent Zero comes from, right? Then everybody is exposed.
No, sure. I mean, I understand. I understand the premise of the whole thing, but I guess what I'm saying, I mean, this has been out now for
weeks and, in fact, months, and there's, as of this morning, 1,459 confirmed cases in the United States. I mean, that is an extremely small number of people who, in fact, have the thing, and you want to keep it that way. But, my frustration isn't even the act that was taken, and I understand the pressures that were there. Sure. But when you're taking acts like this that are based on this, I want this to be evidence-based decision-making. And rather than, the way that we look, and I think that the Big Sky Conference could have taken the lead, even if they would have closed the thing down, to come out and say, here are the reasons why we're doing this. Not because the Big Ten did it, not because the SEC did it, because we in Idaho right now, and by the way, as one of the only 2 states left, along with Montana, that have yet, at last I saw, to have a confirmed case of this. But nonetheless, that's what I would like to have heard. And I didn't hear any of that. In fact, I didn't hear anything from anyone. We heard, there's no tournament anymore, that's it, and that's all. And so, that's the thing that leaves me really wanting and frustrated, even though I do understand why the decision was made. And again, I'm not even criticizing and saying it wasn't the right decision. I just hate the way it came about and the lack of explanation that there is about the reasoning behind it beyond everybody else was doing it.
This entire conversation is way too tenuous to actually go down the road because it's just too controversial and it's just too politically fueled. Let's talk about how this is going to actually impact the sports world going forward.
I mean, I just don't. I don't understand your perspective on this at all. I really don't. All I'm trying to understand is this has nothing to do with politics to me. This has nothing to do with the media. What do you want me to say? That the Big Sky's a bunch of sheep and they're just following in the wake? I mean, that's what it is. It's what it always has been. That is what it is. And I'm saying they had an opportunity to not do that today. They had the opportunity to not do that. They had the opportunity, but it was not in their hands. It has nothing to do with the conference or athletics. It had everything to do with the university presidents. I rode up the elevator, Tom Wisher said this was not up to me. Totally. They canceled it. It's over. And that's fine, but also that should be, first of all, announced. Like, people should understand where these decisions are coming from, if that's in fact the case. And also an explanation just in general, about why this was important for this conference in this city. You know what I mean? Because it's not all the same. The SEC tournament and wherever it was, Auburn or whatever, is not the same thing as the Big Sky Conference tournament in Boise. You're talking about gatherings of tens of thousands of people. You're talking about gatherings of a few hundred people up until probably the championship nights in the next couple of days. I mean, today, how many people would have been in CenturyLink Arena for these games at the most? Like when Montana played Idaho State tonight at 8 o'clock, it would have been the most people that would have been present. Maybe a couple thousand, right? And again, that's a fair number of people, and if you have a quickly traveling virus, something like that, it could be a problem. But it's also different from 70,000 people at the Final Four or an NBA game or an NHL game. So, and it feels like none of that stuff was ever really taken into consideration. It's Tutel Nuanez, 102.9 ESPN Radio, SWX Montana Television. Filter, when we look at the situation as it stands now, what do you think is the next right thing for the conference and for the schools and the presidents to do? Like, what can they do to? They're not going to make this stuff up. Like, they're not going to make it good. You know what I mean? But where do you go from here? One thing that I would like to see, and I don't think it's going to happen, but I would love it if on the information that they do have, the NCAA selection committee put a bracket out. I think that there's a lot of kids on a lot of teams that deserve to see where they are, what their body of work represented on a national scale. And I don't think I understand we don't have tournament champions. I understand there's a whole bunch of bubble teams that would have won and not and gotten in, or lost and not gotten in, but we don't know that. But you could still look at how where we're at right now and the teams that you would have selected and take the conference champions from the one bid league, Eastern Washington for the men, Montana State for the women from the Big Sky, and put a bracket together so that those kids can at least say, hey, you know what? This was a tournament. This was a tournament that didn't happen, but this is a tournament that I would have been in, that I earned a place in. I think that would be a nice gesture. It's a good idea. I like it. I mean, I think that's the things that we should talk about are the impact of sports, especially from an economic perspective, because
at the end of the day, college athletics is completely money-driven, and I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just a reality of the situation. Yep. But my first thought when the Big Sky canceled this thing was they had to cancel it midweek. So they had to cancel it before, like you're saying, almost all the games that would have garnered the best attendance played out. There's a good crowd at the Idaho State women's game last night, but it's not the kind of crowd that would have been here for Montana State versus Portland State, Montana versus Idaho State. I mean, there was going to be some crowds today that were going to be pretty decent crowds. Tomorrow, good crowd. Saturday, depending on who makes it, right? Depending on who makes it, but I mean, if you get a Montana Eastern Washington in the championship, it's a good crowd. That place would be close to full, probably. It's a lot of revenue for the Big Sky Conference. Yeah. They pour a lot of money into hosting this event. And that's where my first thought was, is the Big Sky just going to completely lose? Are they going to lose their butts on this big time? Right. But then I thought, the insurance policies, right? Yeah. That's one thing that's been talked about on Twitter. Almost every conference tournament has an insurance policy attached to it in case a catastrophic event like this happens. And so that's going to be what's so interesting, because obviously the Big Sky collecting whatever their insurance policy may be, assuming that they have one, I assume that they do. Yeah. They do. I have no idea what the nature of it, but I know for a fact that they do have an insurance policy. So, okay, you get some money there. That's fine. But what's going to happen? I mean, the NCAA tournament is such a gigantic $1 billion. One tournament, $1 billion. Right. And so then what happens? Right. If the NCAA and each host site has their own individual policy too, this could have a gigantic impact, if not crash a certain sector of the insurance world right now. That's very concerning in itself. The other thing that I thought of was there's so many small cities in America that host tournament sites, like Spokane is set to host a tournament site. That's a gigantic economic impact on the city of Spokane, no doubt. I mean, Spokane is big by Pacific Northwest standards. It's not a big city. It's what, 350,000 people? 300? Probably 600 in that. The metro area from Coeur d'Alene, sure. But I mean, it's not like this gigantic 4, 5, 6 million person city like some of the other big places like Houston and New York and Chicago. It's not like that at all. So having 15, 20,000 people descend upon your city, it's a big economic boost. Well, and the other thing is it's not 15,000 or 20,000 just more people. 15,000 to 20,000 more people who are actively spending money, and sometimes a lot of it in your town. It's not just a resident who's going to buy lettuce, right? I mean, these are people who are putting down hundreds of dollars on hotels, on dinners, on drinks. They're going out. They're here for the experience of the thing. So you're absolutely right on that. The one thing I'm wondering about is if there was an insurance. I mean, I think there is, again, like you said, the insurance policy for the NCAA that pays out the money. The money for the NCAA, I don't know exactly how they divvy it up, but obviously a significant portion of what the revenue is from this tournament is what is then paid back to the conferences and schools that participate in the tournament. We've spent a lot of time talking about, staggered out over 6 years for each game that a team from your conference plays in, you get X number of dollars. Right. If they get all the money, but they don't have anybody to pay it out to because nobody played, what happens to that? How do they figure out what they're going to do? Because, I mean, I guess you could just put it in a savings account or whatever. I guess, I'm probably not the only person who's a little bit lacking of trust in exactly how every dime would be spent or used. But that's just another sort of knot in the very naughty string that has just started yesterday night and today. And that's why it's so detrimental to the Big Sky specifically that the Montana State women didn't make it. Right. Do I really think that they were going to just be a shoo-in to win a game? No, but they would have got a way better draw than, say, Eastern Washington or even Eastern, if they would have won this thing, they would have been a 26-win team, but a lot of those wins were low level. It would have been, at best case scenario, 15. Best case, but more likely a 16. Yeah. And they're not going to win a game. Right. The MSU women could, just because they do have the veteran talent. They have some. Yeah. They have the ability to do it just because they wouldn't be as overwhelmed physically. Right. So if they were to do it, though, that would be a huge boon for the league because no Big Sky team, has won an NCAA game in quite some time on either side. But on the women's side, I think the streak is actually even longer than it is on the men's side. And so that's detrimental to the league in that element as well. And you just have to feel so bad just because of just the history that's attached to this, just the uncertainty that's attached to this. Yeah. Montana State secures their first winning season in 10 years because they didn't play today. What a horrible way to do it. The Montana State men I'm talking. Right. What a horrible way for that to go down. Right. Yeah. Portland State had to endure this crazy lone wolf schedule, and they entered the tournament on a 7-game winning streak. What if they were that Cinderella? Yes, totally. Montana doesn't get a chance to defend their tournament title. They had a chance to be one of the only three consecutive tournament champions, right? Cy Pridgett doesn't get a chance to lead his team all the way to victory. Jonah Radabaugh is not getting a chance to have revenge on Southern Utah, the team that knocked Northern Colorado out as a 2 seed last year. Yeah. John Newley has been the wizard of neutral site tournaments between his time in the WAC and his time in the Big Sky in Idaho. I was reading an article on Coach Newley last night in the Idaho Statesman. On neutral court tournaments, John Newley at the University of Idaho is 15-3 since 2013. It's pretty much unbeatable. I mean, that's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Yeah. So, of all the people, I bet you he's the one that's actually the most bad because he had the Idaho Vandals playing well. Yep. They're the only team that beat Montana State. They won in Bozeman, so his team has confidence going into that game. They're the only team that's solved the puzzle. It is the Montana State women. They were up by one. This was the last game of the Big Sky Conference tournament. It was the Idaho State women's basketball game last night. It was a 1-point game at the end of the third quarter, and Idaho went on and won that thing by 13, 14 points. I mean, they completely rolled, and that would have been a heck of a matchup for a Montana State team that, even though they've won, had not been anything like the dominance that they were during the second half of the regular season. That is for sure. We're going to spend some more time talking, especially about the kids whose careers have come to a close and what potentially was out there. Also at the top of the hour, I think Coulter and I want to go through and maybe have a little fun, at least try to have a little fun on this. It's a pretty depressing day in a lot of ways, but absolutely, it's a horrendously depressing day, man. Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. I mean, losing isn't the worst thing, right? Not being able to play is the worst thing. So, and I know all about that, by the way. But Coulter, we'll go through and take a look at maybe what was or what could have been, given the way that this tournament was setting up, and sort of have our own little fill in the bracket. But next, Leon Costello did have a few words. He did address the media on the square early this afternoon. So we will play some of that sound for you and discuss his perspective as the athletic director at Montana State University. It's Tutel Nuanez, 102.9 ESPN Radio. By the way, Mildenberger Motors in Hamilton is the best selection and best prices of new and used GMC, Chevrolet, Cadillac, and Buick. Mildenberger Motors, family-owned for 65 years. Back after this.
Get March markdowns at Carl Tyler Chevrolet. Right now, save big on this 2019 Blazer all-wheel drive with leather interior, power panoramic sunroof, navigation, and Bose audio. Now $5,800 off. Or take advantage of $4,900 off this 2019 Trax LT all-wheel drive. Visit us today at 3663 North Reserve Street or gmofmontana.com. Carl Tyler Chevrolet. Find new roads.
At the Montana Club, our goal is to create a menu of mouth-watering food with variety to satisfy any craving. From the garden-fresh ingredients in our salads to our succulent, perfectly grilled Montana Club Angus steaks, we take pride in every detail that goes into preparing your food. Top off your meal with a premium cocktail, wine, or microbrew. Come as you are and satisfy your craving with our home-style breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the Montana Club on Brooks and North Reserve, Missoula.
You can celebrate St. Patrick's Day for a week with Irish flavors from Florence Coffee Company, like the smooth Nutty Irishman, the decadent Lucky Charm, or delicious Peppermint Patty. While you're stopped, pick up a fresh ground bag of Floco coffee to make an authentic Irish coffee at home. You can find the recipe at FlorenceCoffeeCo.com. Happy St. Patrick's Day all week long from Florence Coffee.
That Have you been in an accident and have no idea what to do? I'm here with Catherine from the Advocates Injury Attorneys.
Unfortunately, people are injured in accidents every day, and dealing with the insurance company can add even more pain to an already bad situation. That is where hiring the Advocates can help. Let us guide you through the process and take on the hassles for you so you can just focus on getting better.
If you've been injured in an accident, give the Advocates a call, 406-640-4444, or online at montanaadvocates.com. The Advocates are on your side.
Are you looking for a checking account that is easy to understand and easy to use? Then Stockman Bank's 406 checking account is for you, offering free online and mobile banking and a free Visa check card. You can access your account anytime, anywhere. Stop by any of our 35 locations statewide and open your account today. A $100 minimum opening deposit required. Stockman Bank, Montana's brand of banking, member FDIC.
Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast is out now. Interviews with every living head coach in the history of the University of Montana men's basketball team.
If you're a basketball fan, you're going to love this. If you're a Grizz fan, you're going to love this. But if you're a Missoulian, you're going to love this as well. One of the greatest parts about living in the state of Montana is how steeped in history it is, and this is a historical art. One of the proudest lineages our community has to offer.
Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast, out now wherever you get your podcasts. Available thanks to Blackfoot Communications, Stockman's Bar, and Berkshire Hathaway Real Estate.
ESPN Missoula Sports Center.
Good afternoon. Ryan Hustel, Colter New Orleans, here for sports news for you, or maybe non-news as it is. United States of America has basically shut down sports. The NC2A officially canceling the big dance, both the men's and women's tournaments, after every conference tournament in America was canceled either last night or this morning. That includes the Big Sky Conference tournament in Boise, which was headed into day 3 today, which never got underway. The final game of the Big Sky Conference tournament turned out to be the Idaho Vandals versus the Idaho State women in the semifinal. Idaho did win that game. They would have gone on to play Montana State, who Coulter managed to win 2 games and get into the championship game as well as the number 1 seed.
The MSU women won for the 17th straight time last night, posting a 76-71 victory over Northern Arizona, moving to the championship game one step away from the NCAA tournament. This morning, 4 quarterfinal games of the Big Sky men's tournament supposed to play out, including Montana State versus Portland State and Montana versus Idaho State. It was all canceled before the opening of the games at noon today. For a couple hours, it was thought maybe the teams would still receive auto bids. Both Montana State and Eastern Washington, the top 2 seeds in the tournament, move on to the big dance. 3 o'clock this afternoon, the NCAA canceled all national tournaments.
This ESPN Missoula Sports Center is brought to you by Aspen Sound.
The only person in any official capacity that I'm aware of that was on the record, I know the Big Sky did send out a release, but the one on the record to talk today was Leon Costello, the athletic director from Montana State. So we will hear what he had to say in full here in just a moment. It is Tutel Nuanez, 102.9 ESPN Radio, SWX Montana Television. You can find us on Twitter as well at Gus Tutel. Straight fire at Gus Tutel today. Been killing it. Did the cage picture earlier, and then I said we were open for business when everybody else is closed. You see that contrast that I'm doing? Very good on Twitter. You can follow me there. At 102.9 ESPN and at Skyline Sports MT as well. Coulter and I are still in Boise. We got to say a big thanks to Stockman's Bank. They got us down here, and they're going to get us back, too. I think we appreciate them very much. They had set up, we were hoping that we were going to be watching Montana State playing right now when we were talking. Harold Frey should be coming very close to attempting a game-winning field goal as we speak, Coulter, but instead you're here staring at me, which I know is very disappointing for you anytime that happens, but particularly today. Thanks to Stockman's Bank for helping us out and getting us down here and participating in our trip to Boise with us. As I mentioned, Leon Costello addressed the media today. We want to play this for you in full and just kind of get the full remarks that he had. It was a multiple-person conversation, multiple media members asking questions, and so some of the questions may not come through as well, but I think it's worth hearing what he had to say. And I give him kudos, Coulter, because there's a lot of people who had an opportunity to talk today that didn't want to talk today. I understand not necessarily wanting to talk, not feeling like you have all the information to say something that's cogent and accurate or have a real explanation. That said, people like me, they want to hear, they want to understand as much as they can about what's going on, even if you say, you know what, I'm sorry, I don't know everything that's going on, but to at least, say that is okay. And I thought that Leon Costello did himself some favors today, or did himself right today, by choosing to go out there and make a statement.
No doubt. And I did reporting all day since the moment we woke up,
right?
And there's a few Big Sky officials that would confirm certain elements of things in terms of the sports elements of this. Blake Barrington is the communications director on the men's side. He did confirm to me that if the NCAA tournament was to continue, that Eastern Washington would get the number 1 seed out of the Big Sky and then take the auto bid into the tournament. Same thing on the women's side. Carl Hunt confirmed that part. Tom Wistrcill, he declined comment. He said, what I said in the press release is my comment for now, and we can reconvene later. But
that's right. He did. He said, we can talk again soon, but as of right now, we're gonna focus on cleaning up, which is exactly what's been going on all day. You're absolutely right.
Tom Wistrcill, he said in the press release, said this decision was not made lightly, and as we know how meaningful our basketball championships are to our student athletes, our coaches, alumni, and fans. After consulting with medical experts, local authorities, and the leadership of our institutions, we feel that this decision is prudent given the health and well-being of all involved. We would be remiss to not acknowledge all of our local partners who helped us increase the interest and attendance of our tournament this year, and we look forward to welcoming those fans back to Boise in March of 2021.
Should we just stay? Should we just ride this thing out, Colter?
Well, there might not be another sporting event to cover, so we might as well just stay. Everybody tells me I'm going to die if I get on an airplane, so we might as well just stay here. No, but this brings me back full circle to a point that I think is worth making, and I think that I understand that there's a lot of vague information, a lot of gray area.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different things going on, and so if you're a person that's a decision-making person in a position of power, you do need to get all the facts straight. I think that this has been such a tumultuous and such a chaotic last 24 hours that I understand that everybody wants to get the facts smoothed out. We talked to Montana. We asked for comments from Montana, from head coach Travis DeCure, as well as some administrators there. They declined comment. So I understand why they would do that.
Absolutely. It's not an indictment on anybody for not talking today. And like you said, it might be the prudent thing to do in a lot of ways.
But also, I think Montana State deserves so much credit for being the leader on this thing. Leon Costello, he's the only athletic director for a school in the Big Sky Conference that had 2 teams that ended their season without a loss at this tournament. The Montana State men were set to play their quarterfinal game. They received a bye. They had not played yet in this tournament. The Montana State women had already won twice. They were set to play in the championship game. But the only school out of all 11 Big Sky schools, 22 Big Sky Conference teams, there's 2 that come from the same institution. That's Montana State. So for Leon to take some time and address it, I appreciate that of him. I think it was very brave of him. I think he was thoughtful in his comments. And I also think the fact that Montana State, even though they didn't have people go on the record in front of television cameras, they did get comments from their coaches as well that they sent out. So we'll share those with you in a little while. I thought Tricia Binford's comments were definitely, I mean, you have to just feel terrible for Coach Binford.
Awful.
She had a chance to display her best team in her 15-year tenure at Montana State in the town that she went to college in, featuring a point guard who is absolutely one of the rising stars in all of women's college basketball.
Not rising, risen. It's risen. Done.
Darian Wright is a star, and she's from here. What an awesome story, and they don't get to finish the deal.
Right.
Devastating. Yeah. So we'll share those comments with you as well. But Leon Costello, we appreciate him for taking a few minutes. So here is his interview conducted around 1 p.m. today. Remember, one fact that's worth remembering, this was about 2 hours before the NCAA had canceled the tournaments,
right, as
well as spring sports being canceled and other things being canceled. So there's a couple questions in here like, will Montana State go to the NCAA tournament? He talks about, but I think it's enlightening as well because he talks about what they think, how they would have handled the situation had that been available as well. So here's Leon Costello talking about the situation in Boise.
Obviously, was an opening statement about where we're at right now.
Yeah.
obviously, we're disappointed that the tournament had to end this way, but also understanding of the precautions that we need to take for the student athletes, for the coaches, for athletic department staff, and the fans that are here, and just what is going on across the country. And so, very disappointed, obviously, from an athletic perspective, but obviously our jobs as administrators is to protect and support our student athletes, their health and well-being. That is paramount, and this is a step and a precaution that we definitely had to take.
You guys are the only school in the league that has both the men's and women's teams that seasons end without a loss. So, I mean, as far as just displaying Montana State's products, that must be massively disappointing for you.
It is. I got a chance to go in and meet with the coaches in each team, and, the emotions are very high because they're, as you prepare all year long for this chance, and then to have it taken away with something that is completely out of your control, I get it. I completely understand it. And I think one day, and as the emotions kind of wear down, I think they're going to understand it as well. But as of right now, the immediacy of this, it hurts them. It really does hurt. But, as we've said, at the end of the day, I think everybody is going to look back at this and say that these are the right steps that needed to take place.
Could you just walk us through the decision-making process, how things just kind of came together?
Yeah, ironically, we had our ADs meetings down here on Tuesday, and the presidents were scheduled to meet this morning. They set that a long time ago. So timing of it was very kind of ironic and coincidental. So they met this morning. We knew that they were meeting, and we knew that this was going to be a topic of discussion. We felt as if, we were going to move on with the tournament being played in front of no fans. But then I think as you saw the dominoes start to fall here this morning, and with the swiftness that it did, we've, in the back of your head, you're saying, okay, it's going to happen to us as well. And then shortly after 10 o'clock, we jumped on a conference call with the commissioner. They had met with the presidents, the conference officials, arena officials, and they made the decision in the best interest of student athletes in the conference tournament to cancel the tournament.
Obviously, the emotions are still raw, but what's the feeling among the seniors specifically?
I think that's the hardest part. On the men's side, looking at Harold Frey and Layden Ricketts, and you have the kid from Montana who came back, and a lot of the Montana kids, young kids, my kids, look up to him as a Montana kid that can play Division I basketball at Montana State. And then you look at Harold Frey and everything that he has meant to Montana State basketball. You just feel for him. Harold wanted that one shot to play in the NCAA tournament and have a chance to compete in that. And then you go to the other side with the seniors on the women's side, and you just feel for them. I mean, a historic season that they were having. One more win would have broken the all-time school record in wins. But even having a team, Trish has built this team up over 4 or 5 years to really do something special and to compete in the NCAA tournament and possibly win some games. You feel for them because as an athlete, as a former athlete, this is what you work so hard for. And to have that taken away right now is really, really tough. Again, the immediacy is very emotional for them, but hopefully they can look back at what they've accomplished and be very happy with what they've accomplished and satisfied with what they've accomplished and understand that this was the right decision to make.
So other universities have already canceled spring sports. I know we're so locked into basketball right now, but have you given that thought, and where are you at?
We're working with our conference officials and we're working with our university to see what the next steps are. Our university has an incident response team that is assessing the entire situation. As of right now, those are still a go. We haven't heard anything otherwise. We actually pulled a team off the road. Track was supposed to go to Cal State Fullerton, the javelin throwers to throw. We said, just with spring break coming up, let's just take it easy on that one. We have one team on the road right now. It's tennis. I just got off the phone with John, they're going to NAU, so I'm working with the NAU officials to see what they're going to do there. And they were supposed to go on to New Mexico, and I believe that the Mountain West just canceled their spring season, so they're not going there. They're going to turn around and come home. But we're talking about, do you jump on a plane? Do you jump on a bus? How are you going to get home? And those are the only teams right now that we have would have had on the road. So working with the tennis team to see how we get them back and what the actions are moving forward. But we will, as an athletic department, we will move in the direction that the university, tells us to, and we'll follow the procedures that they tell us.
It's kind of been a thing all week, just that this could be a possibility. Did it really hit and really start feeling real yesterday when some of the larger tournaments started, not letting fans in and things like that? Is that when things really started to feel more serious, maybe?
Yeah, I think I got the feeling when Dayton did it, to have the first 4 events and have no fans, and then all of a sudden the NCAA tournament comes out and says that. You felt like as everything started to transfold, that you're like, okay, it's going to hit us, and we're going to have to do something. And I just think I'm just shocked at the immediacy of everything and how quickly that it did happen. And kudos to them for everybody for making those decisions and with the best interests of the student athletes and the programs and things at heart. But it's still surreal. I don't know if it still hit us yet. It doesn't feel. It feels like it's a dream right now. It doesn't feel like it's real.
What is the information that you were given about the virus itself and what the spread of it is that felt like for whoever was making those decisions that this was the right one?
We haven't received any of that information, and that's where we leave all those decisions to people, whether they're the health officials or the conference officials. They have more of that information. We don't have any of the detailed information, but as you see it with other athletes now contracting it, like in the NBA and things like that, and knowing that it spread through big crowds, it just made a whole lot of sense to say, okay, let's take a step back and take a look at what we're doing here.
The NCAA rules read that, if a conference tournament began, then the top remaining seed gets the automatic bid if that tournament is canceled. Yeah. So if the NCAA tournament does happen, will Montana State's women will they take that auto bid?
Well, we would be in line for that. Where we go from here, I have no idea. Right. We haven't discussed whether or not we would want to put our team on the road and go play in an environment such as that. I think there are others that are saying that they wouldn't do that, but we have not discussed that. I would be shocked if it does go on, if the tournament does go on, as they've stated, but we'll have those discussions later on if that does come to fruition.
With only one game left in the women's tournament, I guess just was there any consideration of moving the schedule around and get that game in?
No. Once they cancel, they cancel.
Thanks, Leon. Appreciate you guys.
So there you go. Leon Costello, the athletic director at Montana State University, addressing the media. And one thing that jumped out to me, first of all, obviously the empathy and the thoughts, of course, that he has for his teams and players and all of that. But also, just ask him, what information were you given as an athletic director at the school about why this decision was made? And the answer is basically, well, none. And again, he said, it's not our decision to make, and that's fine. The process is above the athletic director's, decision making. But also, you would think that, you would think there would be some line of communication from the presidents to the conference to the ADs at the least, to the coaches, to the players, to everybody else, and it just doesn't seem to be there. And that's the second most frustrating thing about this to me. The first is that this has happened.
The answer is always going to be student-athlete welfare. That's hot air, as well as just the buzzwords that they choose to stand upon, but also it's a reality of the situation and something that should be prioritized at the same time. You also mentioned just the way it spreads in crowds. I think that the most worrisome part, I think the reason that this went from we're going to have hand sanitizer at every single event to we're going to play these games with no fans to the games are over in the span of less than a week is because of the travel aspect of it. If you're going in and out of airports, people are then exposed to each other all over the country. I think that was the worry. Yeah, right? You never know when one person who's an official from a place across the country. I've heard the argument all week that Idaho and Montana, the two inland states that do not have any confirmed cases, most of the people that are going to be at this tournament are from Idaho and Montana. So the argument for people that said, let's carry on, was that this place is isolated. We can be safe. But I think so much of it has been when does an official from Virginia come in here? When does, some evaluator or just some parent from Seattle?
How many family members are from the Bay Area, Southern California, whatever, Seattle and all that? So, yeah, that's all what it is. Let's stop you and me doing this. Because we got somebody who's way more depressed than the two of us to get in here and talk. Sean Rady's got nothing to do. I don't even know if he's got a job anymore, but he's going to come on here with us and talk about the the cancellation of the Big Sky Conference tournament, the moving back of opening day of Major League Baseball, which is his most depressing thing in all of this, and continue on a conversation about where we're at in non-sports in America right after this. A Stockman's Bank invites you to experience the Stockman difference. As a family-owned community bank with locations throughout Montana, Stockman Bank is committed to enriching the lives of Montanans and helping communities succeed. What that means to you is your money stays in the local economy, supporting your friends and neighbors. When you bank with Stockman, you receive personalized customer service, and your phone call is answered by a live person. Their highly skilled and personable bank staff is dedicated to making it easy to transfer your accounts and meeting your overall financial needs. Blending traditional Western values with modern conveniences and state-of-the-art technology, they provide time-tested products and services from people who truly care about you and your financial success. As Montana's brand of banking, Stockman's Bank is a proud sponsor of Grizzly Athletics and the University of Montana. Thank you to all of the players for your hard work and dedication. Go Grizz. Stockman's Bank, Montana's brand of banking, member FDIC.
Are you looking for a checking account that is easy to understand and easy to use? Then Stockman Bank's 406 checking account is for you, offering free online and mobile banking and a free Visa check card. You can access your account anytime, anywhere. Stop by any of our 35 locations statewide and open your account today. $100 minimum opening deposit required. Stockman Bank, Montana's brand of banking, member FDIC.
Carl Tyler's Missoula Volkswagen annual green handle diesel sale happening now. Save big on our pre-owned TDI diesels with Carl Tyler's lifetime powertrain warranty included at no cost to you. Visit Carl Tyler's Missoula Volkswagen and score a great deal. Located at 3665 North Reserve Street or MissoulaVW.com.
College basketball madness is happening again, and there's only one place in town to catch all the games, the Desperado. Catch every buzzer beater, every Cinderella story, and every upset on the Despo's 32 TVs, while getting your fill of the best hot wings Missoula has to offer, of course. Bracket busted? Now the Despo's got you covered there, too, with cold drinks by the pint or pitcher. The Despo is your headquarters for NCAA basketball, NHL, and NASCAR, too. The Desperado Sports Tavern on South Russell, across from the Y.
You hear the term small business all the time, but what does it mean? The answer is, it depends. Whether you're a one-woman show or employ over 100 people, at Farmers State Bank, your business is never small to us. Find the tools for success at any Farmers State Bank location, or check us out online at farmersebank.com. Farmers State Bank, helping businesses succeed since 1907. Member FDIC.
Well, Coulter, Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast series has been one of the most fun things we've ever done here at ESPN Radio, and we've rolled through the history, and now we roll into the present. Episode 9 with current head coach of the University of Montana Grizzlies men's basketball team, Travis DeCuire.
DeCuire was an outstanding player for the Grizzlies in the early 1990s and still holds the program's all-time record for assists in a career. After playing for Blaine Taylor at Montana and coaching under Coach Taylor at Old Dominion, DeCuire joined Mike Montgomery's staff at Cal, where he spent 6 seasons as an assistant coach before taking over at his alma mater before the 2014 campaign.
Coach DeCuire is certainly a man who understands and appreciates the history of the University of Montana, and it was a pleasure to speak with him. We hope you enjoy Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast, episode 9 with Travis DeCuire. If you're looking for it, just search Grizz Greats anywhere you get your podcasts. And Grizz Greats is brought to us by Blackfoot Communications, Stockman's Bar, and Berkshire Hathaway Real Estate.
Tutel and Nuanez on 102.9 ESPN Radio for Missoula.
Welcome back to Tutel and Nuanez, 102.9 ESPN Radio, SWX Montana Television, from our very comfortable studio on the 9th floor of the Grove Hotel.
We are happy. Here we are. Yeah, here we are. Great view, by the way. This is spectacular out this window. It's actually funny, though, because it is actually the easiest way to get guests, right? That's right. You don't have to say, Sean, drive across town. Brooks, drive over across the state. No, you guys are actually just here. Get on the elevator and come on up. Sean Rainey joining us in studio. By the way, Carl Tyler Chevrolet, the exclusive home of Carl Tyler's lifetime powertrain warranty. Sean, I'd ask you how you are, but I already know the answer. But this has been a weird day, man. It's like it's the sort of thing where when catastrophes have happened in the past, around global things and stuff like that, usually there's something you can see. Like you can see the smoke billowing up. You can see, whatever it is. This is like all this stuff is happening, and there's nothing really behind it that you notice. You know what's going on, but you don't feel it. So it has this very odd sort of post-apocalyptic feel, or maybe pre-apocalyptic feel, or whatever it is. But it's not a fun day for the sports people in America right now.
No, and I mean, last night when we were talking, we thought that, there's going to be a good chance on Thursday at some point the Big Sky's going to be like, all right, no more fans for the rest of the tournament. And that's kind of the route that we thought it would go. We thought it would go to no fans. It would be played in an empty stadium with just, family and media and essential personnel there, and that was it. And then you wake up, and not only is the Big Sky tournament canceled, but the NCAA tournament canceled, and all spring sports, and all of it all at once. And it's been it's been weird. It's like when something like this happens, it's almost like your adrenaline starts going in the immediate news of it, and everything's kind of crazy. And so you're kind of just like pumping, and then like even now, like a few hours later, and then I'm sure even tomorrow morning, you're just going to wake up like, and the depression of it, all of it, is going to really hit, because I don't know if it's like fully even hit yet. Yeah. Because you're still kind of like, it's still so fresh that it's like the impact of it all hasn't really hit until March rolls around and there's no games.
I asked our producer David Graff what he's going to do with his 40 hours a week that he now has to fill when he doesn't have any games to watch. So he said he bought an Xbox, because he actually did buy an Xbox. So what are you going to do? Books? Karaoke? What are we doing? What's Sean Rainey going to do now?
So we have our SWX Tonight show, which is 30 minutes, and we have that in KHQ as well in Spokane. Yeah. And right out of there, and their producer put on Twitter, he's like I'm looking for any ideas for this full 30 minutes, thinking about having some Mario Kart 64 tournaments, and I was like, that's probably going to be atop the list. Right,
esports gets a huge boost out of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a very good point. When it comes to just this tournament, the Big Sky Conference tournament, where did you think this thing was headed? Like, what was it? What was the feel like to you as it had started the first couple of days in year two?
I mean, as far as like who's going to win, or as far as just having the tournament here?
Yeah, the tournament here. It felt to me like it was a little bit more ingrained. People knew where to go, what to do.
The tournament here is awesome.
I thought they had, they shifted. There's certain things that they did that people wouldn't know, that were just fans in the building or whatever, but they used to have the media food right behind the curtain where the press conferences did. That was a bad idea. It's just like, it's one of those things you're like, so they moved it. Like, that's they do things like that. Yeah.
All the kinks were worked out in year one, and I think it's awesome here in Boise. The court is, and the arena is 10 times better. Yeah. The setup is better. The city is better. The location for everything is better.
The city's better. The other thing that they did I thought that was great is that the city itself, like the Department of Tourism here, as well as then the facility here, the CenturyLink Arena and the Grove Hotel, they marketed the tournament to people that just live in Boise. So it wasn't a crazy amount, but I saw people and talked to people that weren't here for anything. They just came to, like, watch hoops. Yeah.
And that's where you get it to that next level.
That's where you get to the next level.
The Boise people.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, and I thought it was fun, too, because I listened to some Boise Sports Talk Radio when I was driving into town. And the local guys, I mean, they were talking about the major sports and obviously about Boise State specifically. But then they got in, they were talking about Jeff Linder and the rumors of him going to Wyoming and the tie that he has to having coached at Boise State, now at Northern Colorado, and the Idaho schools in the tournament and all of that. And this was like, in a town of Boise size, this was sort of a medium-sized event that was, I think, garnering more attention locally than it certainly did in year one. And it's too bad. Hopefully something that can carry over.
Yeah. And you get Trisha Bitberg, Boise State alum, and
right.
Darian White
from Boise,
was on her way to being the conference MVP.
Yeah, all the ties. We had to do a short segment here because we had
Leon Costello on a little bit long, so we will take a quick break. We'll come back hour number 2 right after this, and we'll continue with our buddy Sean Rainey from SWX Television, get into some more things, or maybe talk about who we think would have actually come out of these brackets right after this. Hey, right now at Kurtz Polaris, it's snow check season. What does that mean? Well, the 2021 Polaris snowmobiles are out in terms of you going in and picking the exact model and style that you want. Their new Chaos models have a new drive system, a quick drive 2. They also have a new 2.75-inch Series 8 track, a factory-installed low-elevation clutching option, and more. Choose from over, are you ready for this, 100,000 combinations. You can customize your sled right now during Snow Check. It's only going on through April 15th. So get over to Kurtz Polaris, 2904 West Broadway in Missoula, Highway 83 in Sealy. Learn more about the 2021 lineup and for special Snow Check warranty and financing offers online, KurtzPolaris.com.
Get March markdowns at Carl Tyler's Missoula Volkswagen. Take advantage of Sign Then Drive with zero due-it signing when you lease this 2020 Tiguan S all-wheel drive for $319 per month. Visit Carl Tyler's Missoula Volkswagen and score a great deal. Located at 3665 North Reserve Street or MissoulaVW.com.
OAC when you finance VW credit. Selling price $24,725. VIN number 3VVOE7AX6LMO329885.
Hi there, it's Les Schwab Alignment and Brakes and Shocks and Wheels and Tires. Some tire places don't offer all that, but we do to help keep you safe. And during the Les Schwab Spring Tire Sale, save up to $110 on a set of 4 select tires. Stop by or book an appointment at leschwab.com. Les Schwab Tires, doing the right thing since 1952. Limited time offer while supplies last. Actual discount amount depends on tire size and type. Cannot be combined with other offers. Details at leschwab.com.
At Opportunity Bank of Montana, we know that checking accounts are not one size fits all. Let us introduce you to Opportunity Bank's full suite of checking account products, including personal and business options with no minimum balance and no monthly service fee. Or if earning cash back suits you, Opportunity Reward Checking may be the perfect fit. Need to earn interest? We have those options too. Call or come into Opportunity Bank for a checking account that fits you. Opportunity Bank of Montana, serving Montanans since 1922. Member FDIC.
For more than 40 years, Boyle, Devney & Meyer has been among the most trusted accounting firms in the state of Montana. Boyle, Devney & Meyer is an experienced, diverse accounting firm rooted in historical Missoula with a look toward the future. They've established a reputation for excellence, teamwork, and community involvement. Whether you're a small business that needs tax assistance or you are a nonprofit or an individual looking for a personal, comprehensive financial plan, Boyle, Devney & Meyer can help. Give Boyle, Devney & Meyer a call today, 721-3555, or visit bbmcpa.com. Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast is out now. Interviews with every living head coach in the history of the University of Montana men's basketball team.
If you're a basketball fan, you're going to love this. If you're a Grizz fan, you're going to love this. But if you're a Missoulian, you're going to love this as well. One of the greatest parts about living in the state of Montana is how steeped in history it is, and this is a historical archiving of one of the proudest lineages our community has to offer.
Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast, out now wherever you get your podcasts. Available thanks to Blackfoot Communications, Stockman's Bar, and Berkshire Hathaway Real Estate.
Have you been hurt or disabled? Are you missing time from work and not sure what to do? I'm attorney Chris Helmer, and Clark Fork Law Offices in Missoula is here to help. Our team specializes in worker compensation, personal injury, and Social Security disability. We fight for the benefits you deserve. Call Clark Fork Law at 728-0168 for a free consultation or visit clarkforklaw.com. Again, 728-0168.
ESPN Radio for Western Montana, KKVU HD3 Stevensville, and 102.9 FM on K275BS Missoula. ESPN Missoula Sports Center.
Good evening, Ryan Tutel, Colter Nuanez. Here's your ESPN Sports Center. And Colter, the basketball season across America has come to a close in abrupt fashion at the collegiate level as every single conference tournament, men's and women's, and ultimately the NC2A National Basketball Tournament has been canceled in the 2020 season. In Boise, Idaho, the Big Sky Conference ended last night. The final game of the conference was Idaho versus Idaho State in a women's semifinal that the Vandals won. They had moved on to play Montana State, who won their first two games, and were awaiting them in the championship game last night. Today was to have been the quarterfinals for the men, but it did not get underway. The Grizzlies playing the last seed in this tournament, Idaho State, who had an upset win yesterday against NAU.
Top-seeded Bobcat women slated to play the championship game, one step away from setting the school record for wins in a single season, as well as advancing to the NCAA tournament for the third time in program history. Once the Big Sky tournament was canceled, they still were set to receive the auto bid into the Big Dance. Then the NCAA tournament was canceled, so their season ends. On the men's side, we missed matchups between Portland State and Montana State, as well as Montana and Idaho State. The careers of outstanding in-state products like Sally Pridgett, Harold Frey, Kendall Manuel finished with no win, no loss, nothing.
This ESPN Sports Center is presented by Clark Fork Law.
Welcome back. Tutel Nuanez, 102.9
Now from the
ESPN Radio.
Polaris studio, here is Ryan Tutel and Colter Nuanez.
And SWX Montana Television. That's right, through the Kurtz Polaris studio today. Colter and I still in Boise, Idaho, and trying to find something to do. Hit us up. What's a great place to go eat? I mean, I guess that's what we're reduced to, as the Big Sky Conference tournament has been canceled and will not be played for the remainder of this week, and we're all left just sort of, well, depressed, crestfallen, and wanting more of what we came here to get and not going to get it. Very unsatisfying and yet understandable given the current circumstances in the situation with the coronavirus and COVID-19. It's Tutel Nuanez. Happy to be with all of you. If you missed anything in the first hour, you can check it out on the podcast. The podcast available wherever you get your podcasts. Available thanks to the Wingate by Wyndham Hotel and Blackfoot Communications. Phone number 329-1899. All guests join us via the Raggett Brothers RV phone line. And if you'd like to listen live on the World Wide Web, you can do just that. 1029ESPN.com. The stream available all the time. Thanks to Opportunity Bank. Your local bank, your opportunity. We started just a little bit with our buddy Sean Rainey from SWX Montana Television, and he is still with us here in the hotel room. We have moved locations. We had to get out of the building, out of the studio setup that we had, and now we're sort of piecemealing this thing together today. So, Sean, thanks for coming up 3 floors and hanging out with us here on the, in the penthouse suite.
Yeah, it's usually always a pleasure joining you guys.
Yeah.
I wish I wasn't today, but
exactly.
Hey, we're trying to make the best of it.
It's the way it goes. Coach, I know a lot of people have been trying to find out what's going on with high school tournaments, state tournaments in Montana, because, there's plenty more basketball that is going on. In particular, 2 tournaments at the 2 universities. So the university is shutting down a lot of their things. I think the University of Montana, is going to remote classes for the next month at least, and we'll see how that goes. But to our knowledge, all of the state basketball tournaments are still ongoing and still happening as we speak. Is that correct?
As we speak, that is correct. Richie Melby just messaged me on Twitter. He said, yes, we're still playing. Conversations are being had, but that only means there hasn't been enough reason to shut us down yet. Sean, when you first came in this room, you said Governor Bullock declared a state of emergency. So you wonder if a state of emergency from the governor is enough to influence the MHSA in terms of shutting these state tournaments that are going on down right now. I don't know, but it seems as if the governor says it's a state of emergency, you probably have to cancel the state tournament.
Well, with what we saw with the Big Sky, it's not necessarily their decision; it's the outside factors and sometimes the pressures in making those decisions. So I thought, with that, and then we heard some rumblings that with the tournaments that were at the universities, because of the university policies, that might pressure or force them to shut down. But it looks like all things are going. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. From high school to the college to the pro ranks, I think there's only 6 states now that are running basketball tournaments. So Montana is one of only 6 places where there is any basketball being played at the high school, college, or pro level. How wild is that?
It might be a little better attended, if that's where you got to go to get it.
On the school campus note, one thing that we discussed with a couple people associated with Montana State specifically, because Montana State's women have a couple girls that are from Boise. So they were discussing, okay, how are we going to get home? But these girls want to stay home for spring break next week, so what are we going to do? Do we leave them here? I know that was a decision they had to be made because you don't want them to have to go to Bozeman and try to figure out how to get back here. But that's my question for you guys, though. It's spring break at University of Montana and Montana State next week. Yeah. If they're moving classes remotely, okay. And now you're going to have a bunch of kids leaving and then coming back. Doesn't that seem as if that's a way for a state that doesn't have any exposure to it to then somehow garner some because people are leaving and then returning?
I mean, maybe so. The thing is there's a level at which, like, you can do the big stuff, right, when you talk about the NC2A tournament and some of the major gatherings that are happening. I know there's a major music festival in Boise that's always the end of this week that has been moved to the fall, and so that sort of stuff. When it comes to, keeping school on to avoid kids leaving, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, the school year is going to end at some point. You're going to go. Maybe it buys you some time. But there's some level at which once individual decision-making, is the thing that's sort of on display, it's hard to legislate that, right?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a tough call. It'll be interesting to see, if these Montana tournaments end up being played fully. I've heard, maybe like the consolation games end up getting canceled. Yeah. We'll see how it goes down the road. I don't know. It's interesting because there's a lot of people on social media that say that Montana's behind the curve and they should be canceling all these tournaments right now, and others that think that all of it is overblown and that they should be playing.
Well, the thing is, in the state of Montana too, the people go. At the Big Sky Conference tournament, people are coming from all over. In the state of Montana, they're coming from all over Montana.
That's not necessarily true because you might just have an aunt from California that comes. I mean, an uncle from Seattle who just comes on over,
I mean,
that's why you have to happen. That's why you have to. I think that's the reason why you can't have to cancel the events, though, because it's not actually because of what could happen. It's because if there's no way to control where the people come from.
Right, but I would like to things isn't. Like, they can still come anyway. Like, if they're already coming for the tournament, they're likely already here. I mean, that tournament's going on.
Right.
So, but the other thing, too, is when it comes to Governor Bullock's state of emergency, like, that is a more formal announcement that sort of allows certain groups of monies and funds to be available and open for different things. And so, I mean, it's not, it's especially in the state of Montana, it seems like it's a thing that he did in advance instead of waiting, for the flood to happen, and then you declare it. He's like, okay, looks like we're getting a lot of rain. We're going to do this right now in a metaphorical sense. And so, that's fine. And him declaring a state emergency doesn't actually influence me all that much into what should or shouldn't be done at the state tournament level. But the two state tournaments, it's Class C that's happening at the University of Montana and Class AA, right, that's happening in Bozeman, because these campuses are taking the action they're taking. And they have a lot of kids who are from different places, but presumably they've been on campus now for some period of time that they wouldn't be bringing it in. But is the venue going to be influential in terms of keeping these tournaments going? I wonder.
No, sure. I don't think at this point it will, but
right. Who knows?
Yeah. So,
Sean, when it comes to sports in general, Stu Tell the One is 102.9 ESPN Radio. Sean Rainey sitting here, couch side with us in the studio, in the makeshift studio that we've got today. I know that you love sports. You love baseball. You're a big fantasy baseball guy. A lot of people take off the first couple of days of the NC2A tournament. You take off opening day.
Mm-hmm.
Sports is a distraction for a lot of people, something that people go to just absorb themselves into. When sports becomes the very thing, first of all, that isn't really there now, and also is the most visual thing of this potentially major problem that has arisen. What do you think that does to people in general, and maybe even to you yourself as an example?
I don't know. I mean, when we were here the last couple of days and just going around and talking to everybody, about it, I mean, everyone that's into sports, it is the escape. It's the thing that everyone can, look forward to in a day. And we've never had it where every single sport is shut down.
It's crazy.
We've never had it. And so I don't know what it's going to be like. I've been trying not to think about it, honestly, because it's depressing. It really is. Like I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what if this lasts. Let's say it lasts for just a month, which I mean that might even be on the optimist side. If it lasts for a month, what are you guys going to talk about? What am I going to be putting in a daily show every single day?
Well, I say thank God for Sports Talk Radio, because we can talk about anything around here. You know what I mean? We can go back classic archives of Tutel Nuanez. Colter, what do you think?
To me, the most worrisome part is, obviously you got to worry about the distraction that sports provides for people. It provides people a lot of joy, a lot of allegiance, a lot of distraction. And, it's just a very cool part of the American fabric, especially the way that we all come together to enjoy the NCAA tournament and events like that. But it's the economic impact that I'm so worried about, because this is going to trickle downhill all the way. If airports get shut down, that's going to impact commerce across the country, for sure. Hotels, we've already received messaging from people that are worried about the hotel industry, because if people aren't traveling, if people stop traveling, what's going to happen to oil prices, gas prices? Then what's going to happen to food prices? What's going to happen to just the general economy that has to do with sports bars? How big of a business is a sports bar around the country? People go there and they're going to be impacted, especially on a local level. There's so many people that are just going to go to places around Missoula, around Montana, just to watch a game. If there's not a game to watch, a lot less people are just going to go out. You're not just going to go out just to spend money a lot of times. So I just worry about all the little downhill trickle that's going to happen from this.
Yeah, and I think of it in other real life terms, as far as are my kids' games going to end up getting canceled? T-ball starts soon. Is T-ball going to stop? Is preschool and
your kids aren't in school quite yet, right?
No, 5. So preschool
about to be, but
T-ball and stuff.
So I've got a few friends that have kids that are in school right now, and the parent-teacher conferences have been going on.
Yeah.
Right. The Missoula County public school system right now is considering going classes remotely, and or completely canceling school after spring break. That could be fascinating too, because all of a sudden, that could impact the child care industry, which I know that people that have kids are like, well, good riddance because it's so expensive, but there's just every little detail here could be impacted by this, and without the distraction and relaxation that comes from it, I just wonder, there's so many people, what are they going to do? If they, what are they going to replace it with? Is everybody just going to play Xbox? I just don't really know if that's the key. I just don't know if there's a lot of people, I think, that struggle with finding joy outside of what they use sports as a distraction for. So then where do they turn? And that's just worrisome in terms of just individual people's mental health, just the way that you navigate your life. It's going to have a huge impact on us across the board, I think.
It certainly will. Where you turn is Tutel Nuanez, because we're not going anywhere. And you just, you get to jump into the sports side of things and have yourself some fun. And, we can talk about anything. We can talk. Now, see, my big issue here, I don't know if Tool's happening on Saturday.
Right.
Now what am I going to do? I have my plaid pants all ready to go. I got a new haircut, going to be right on top of it for fear inoculum, and now I'm sitting here I got to say it to myself. You into Tool, Sean?
Not so much.
That shocks me. It just shocks me. Everything that I know about you.
Yeah.
You don't even listen to music, really, do you?
Not a huge music guy.
We talked about this.
Not a huge music guy. No, I listen to it at the gym, working out and stuff. Although not recently. Recently, it's all been fantasy baseball podcasts.
Oh, is that the thing?
Burning
calories for you?
Prep work. We had a big time draft. It's 6.5 hours.
Absolutely.
As far as stuff that's happening by us locally, I think there's a Spokane tournament sites. The fact that there's going to be a men's and women's tournament there, that's the thing that I think is the most disappointing for people that we just work directly with. SWX is based out of Spokane. You have a lot of colleagues, Sean, that are there. If any team from the Big Sky, particularly teams from Montana, would have advanced out of this tournament to the NCAA tournament, we all certainly would have gone. It would have had a very positive impact on our jobs and our careers. But David, right now, he just messaged that he has a soundbite from Mark Few, Gonzaga longtime head coach, queued up. So, David, when you're ready, let's go ahead and play that Mark Few sound about his reaction to the NCAA tournament being canceled.
Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I've just told in my ear that Mark Emmert has just announced that the men's and women's tournaments, along with all winter sports, have been canceled. I may be the one that's giving you that news right now, and if so, what's your reaction to that?
Extremely disappointed. Extremely disappointed. I think all of us felt we could postpone and even postpone into May or whatever, and then if we needed to cancel, we could cancel then. But if that's what they're doing, then I guess that's what they're doing.
So there you go, Mark Few. And that's another thing, Coulter, is I mean, when you have all the sites set up and the days and the times, I understand at a certain level where, like, it's not as if you can just go, well, let's shoot for next weekend. You know, it's not like you and your buddies getting together for a barbecue. It's so much logistics, planning, preparation, and all that. But also, I mean, would anybody care? I mean, if you did this in August? I mean, maybe you can't practice until then. I understand that, but like, did it have to be just no? We're not doing it.
That's one point that Brooks made. Brooks Nuanez is sitting right over here on the bed, and one point that he made was Trayshawn Malone was one of only 4 Big Sky Conference athletes for track and field that was advanced to the indoor national championships that are being held right now.
Yeah,
he's in the long jump. It's an individual event. He was getting warmed up to make his first attempt at the long jump, and they came down and said, this has been canceled effective immediately. And he tweeted and he said, what's up? Like, I was on the runway. Can I just do the jump somewhere? Anywhere? Can I do it at my place? Can I do it later? Anytime. Can I just have a chance to jump on the national stage? Let's get everybody together sometime in the future. Because the next indoor championships are not till next March. So they have a full year to figure this out. If this stuff calms down, why not just have an impromptu gathering, or have everybody do it on video at their own place so you don't even have to travel there? And for an individual sport like track, that seems like such an easy solution, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, he's there doing it. That's the thing that I'm still not completely sold on. Like, the stuff that is on, that has been going on. I mean, the Dallas Mavericks are ready to tip off the basketball game. Everybody that's going to be there is there. I understand now if you're spending 3 more hours in close quarters, okay, but like
handle on the bathroom door or whatever.
The ultimate place where that's going to happen is when you go in and when you go out. Believe me, I know. I was at the last, thank God, home game of the Boston Bruins in Massachusetts, and you know, when are you rubbing up against people? On your way in there, on your way out. That's the time.
In the NCAA skiing championships, were
in Bozeman,
in Bozeman.
In the middle,
canceled in Bozeman in the middle. It was like
it's going to be hard to do that in August. I will say, doing the ski tournament in August is a tough one.
Sean, you were down in the Grove Plaza earlier, and you did a little video with fan reaction. Just share some of that.
Well, I mean, people were surprised. And a lot of them were pretty upset by the decision.
You had one guy with a Montana State hat on saying, "We're already here. Why can't I just stay?"
Yeah, and people really think that this is a media overblowing the whole entire situation deal. There's a vast majority of the people are believing that and thinking the guys like, hey, if there's no confirmed cases in Montana and Idaho, why are we canceling this?
Right.
And then they whether you agree with that or not. That is a large opinion on a lot of people. But the other thing that there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it is we paid for 4+ nights at a hotel. We paid for tickets. We paid to get here.
Right.
And all of that, I mean, not only do we not get to see games and we feel bad about these kids and blah, 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 like we're spending a lot of money that's pretty much just going down the drain.
Just for nothing. Yeah, exactly. You can see the Capitol anytime. It's 210 Nuanez, 1029 ESPN Radio, SWX Montana Television. Outstanding to be with you on this Thursday, a very odd Thursday afternoon. By the way, Carl Tyler Chevrolet, discover ownership peace of mind with Carl Tyler's lifetime powertrain warranty.
That's one factor I had not actually thought about is we're all here for work. So to a certain extent, we're getting paid to be here. The amenities that we're receiving or that we paid for or whatever, I mean, we're getting a little bit of help with it, whatever it might be. The schools, they have it in their budget. Yeah, it's not a catastrophe to have to leave early. Like Montana State, instead of flying home, they just got a bus. They drove home. Montana, same thing. They just got on a bus. That's all. That is what it is. One of the main arguments from coaches to move the tournament to a neutral site was to make it easier for family and friends, but specifically family, to attend. Coming to Missoula on late notice, the first week of March,
good luck.
When somebody wins the tournament on Saturday and it starts on Thursday, there's so many families that can't afford it. It doesn't matter what kind of money you make. That's going to cost you thousands of dollars. So just be able to do it on a whim and then find somewhere to stay, it's tough. So these kids were then not going to be able to play in front of their mom and dad. They're very, if you're a senior, you're not going to do it. But I never thought about that element. There is definitely
even though they're associated with the school, there's definitely parents here that booked this trip to see their kid play their last sporting event of their lives.
Yeah. Well, all of the time, too, when you're talking about the seniors, I mean, they book trips to Missoula, to Bozeman the week before to go see senior night, and then you're booking a trip down to Boise for the tournament. Like, it's a lot of money that you're spending to travel, and for this to be canceled, I mean, it's a huge bummer for everybody.
Stu Tell Nuanez, 102.9 ESPN Radio. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll hear some of what Tricia Binford had to say, her reaction to Montana State head women's basketball coach, who maybe has a reason to be at the most disappointed of just about anybody about this. And also, we will play a little bit with you in terms of moving teams through who we thought was hot, who we thought was good, and what might have happened if we were playing quarterfinal basketball games on the men's side today. Stu Tell Nuanez, ESPN Radio, back right after this.
In Western Montana, we know shopping local matters, and you may think you'd pay more for the quality and customer service that comes with it, but not at Selway Armory. Selway Armory is locally owned with knowledgeable specialists that can answer your questions. In addition to the expertise, though, Selway Armory also has a bigger selection and lower prices than the box stores. When you're in the market for firearms and accessories, save money with the experts at Selway Armory. Selway Armory, 2825 Stockyard Road, Unit E6, and online at selwayarmory.com. Don't enter the madness without the knowledge you need. When it comes to filling out NCAA tournament brackets, you can rely on luck, or you can get yourself ready to win the Tutela Nuanez Bracket Challenge by watching the stretch run of the regular season and every conference tournament at Paradise Falls. Come down to Paradise Falls to watch every college basketball game you need to prepare for the tournament, and be sure to enter the Tutela Nuanez Bracket Challenge with your chance to win $400 in free food and drinks from Paradise Falls. Leap into March Madness in Paradise at Paradise Falls.
The Advocates want you to remember that warmer weather means more people will be out and about. Remember, slow down in residential areas because kids will be riding their bikes or their scooters or walking their dogs or enjoying the sunshine. School is still in session, so watch for kids and make sure to obey school bus laws. If you're injured due to someone else's negligence, the Advocates can help. Speak with an experienced attorney for free. Call 640-4444 or chat with an attorney online 24/7 at montanaadvocates.com. You deserve an advocate.
This is Mike Nugent with Berkshire Hathaway Home Services. Berkshire Hathaway provides Western Montana with full-time real estate professionals for you whenever you need us. Our reputation as the state's most knowledgeable and available real estate group has helped build unmatched trust in the Garden City and statewide. If you have been thinking of making a real estate move in the short or long term, give me a call. No pressure, no expectations. Just professional opinions and service at whatever pace you are comfortable with. Give me, Mike Nugent, a call today, 531-1802. And remember, every question is good to ask.
Well, Coulter, Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast series has been one of the most fun things we've ever done here at ESPN Radio, and we've rolled through the history, and now we roll into the present. Episode 9 with current head coach of the University of Montana Grizzlies men's basketball team, Travis DeCuire.
DeCuire was an outstanding player for the Grizzlies in the early 1990s and still holds the program's all-time record for assists in a career. After playing for Blaine Taylor at Montana and coaching under Coach Taylor at Old Dominion, DeCuire joined Mike Montgomery's staff at Cal, where he spent 6 seasons as an assistant coach before taking over at his alma mater before the 2014 campaign.
Coach DeCuire is certainly a man who understands and appreciates the history of the University of Montana, and it was a pleasure to speak with him. We hope you enjoy Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast, episode 9 with Travis DeCuire. If you're looking for it, just search Grizz Greats anywhere you get your podcasts. And Grizz Greats is brought to us by Blackfoot Communications, Stockman's Bar, and Berkshire Hathaway Real Estate.
ESPN Missoula Sports Center.
Good afternoon, Ryan Tutel, Colton Nuanez, 102.9 ESPN Sports Center. Well, the day that was supposed to be the men's quarterfinals in the Big Sky Conference basketball tournament turned out to be nothing, as the basketball tournaments across the country, including the Big Sky tournament, were all canceled. And then later this afternoon, also the NC2A National Tournament, both men's and women's, all no longer going to be taking place in the year 2020. The matchups, as they were set to be, Coulter, were going to be the Montana Grizzlies playing the 11th-seeded Idaho State Bengals, who had upset Northern Arizona last night and were coming in with a little momentum. Would have been a great nightcap matchup that was not to be, along with 3 others. Montana State also set to play Portland State in the men's quarterfinals. On the women's side, a day off for the women after Montana State and Idaho advanced to the championship game. Upon the cancellation of the tournament, it was assumed that the number 1 seed Eastern Washington Eagles from the men's side, number 1 seeded Montana State Bobcats from the women's side,
would receive the automatic bids to the NCAA tournament. Within 2 hours after the decision to cancel the Big Sky tournament was made, the NCAA tournament canceled across the country as well. And finally, in other sports news, the NBA season has been suspended. The NHL season has been suspended. Opening day of Major League Baseball has been pushed back indefinitely. And perhaps even the NFL season, as the CBA deadline has also been put back. Now we wait. Welcome back to Joe Nuanez, 102.9 ESPN Radio, SWX Montana Television. Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast series out. Episode 9 with Travis DeCuire, the current head coach of the Montana Grizzlies. Great conversation with him. You can go listen to it wherever you get your podcast. Download it. Great review. We still got another one coming next week with Robin Selvig. So we'll look forward to that as well. Are you ready for a new truck? Go to Mildenberger Motors in Hamilton. The best deals and the best trucks, Duramax, Chevy, GMC. We are joined by Sean Rainey and also Brooks Nuanez. Man, we were just having a full-on gathering here in the hotel room. Happy to be along with you from Boise, Idaho. Obviously, everybody into their secondary and tertiary alternatives in terms of trying to get the work done that they need to get done. So we appreciate you being with us and letting us be on board with you on your radios and TVs around the state of Montana. And, guys, one thing I wanted to just talk about was the would-have-beens. You know, today, normally on the show, we would have been talking in part significantly about the matchup between Montana State and Idaho in the women's championship game. Montana State, I think, would have been the overwhelming favorite on the outside. They won 18 in a row coming into this game. They're the number 1 seed, 19-1 in the tournament or in the regular season, in the conference. But as Coulter, you pointed out before, John Newley's 15-3 on neutral site games in the postseason, and nobody's going to tell Coach Newley that he's not going to win a basketball game. This would have been a great game tomorrow night. What do you think would have happened?
Well, it would definitely have been a great game because the one team in the league that had the confidence to beat Montana State because they had already done it was Idaho.
Idaho, yeah, an overtime win. They're the one team that got it done, right?
It's also a very interesting matchup because Idaho has a couple really good perimeter defensive players. No one can stay in front of Darian White, but I think that Gina Markson could have at least given the best ride to the best effort at it.
Yeah.
Montana State wears teams out so much because they run this platoon at center where they play 20 minutes of Blair Braxton and 20 minutes of Adeline Smith.
Right.
Idaho has the Clinker sisters. The Clinker sisters are two of the most physical players in the league. So the matchup in terms of personnel still favored Montana State because Montana State has no question the best personnel in the league.
And the most veteran group.
The most veteran, right. They're the one that knows how to play together the most. And they just seem like a team of destiny. They're playing so well. They're hot. They said this is a business trip. They came here to finish this and get this thing done. You have this great Cinderella story and Darian White playing back in her hometown for the first time since graduating high school and likely going to win conference tournament MVP.
Yeah.
All sorts of great things favoring Montana State. But John Newley has been the guy that is shaking this thing up. And, I mean, he's got an NCAA tournament at Idaho 4 times out of the last 7 years. So he knows how to win, whether it was in the WAC or the Big Sky. So it would have been a really good game because I think Idaho would have not been scared whatsoever to make it ugly with Montana State, and it would have taken Montana State's best effort to get past the Vandals.
Sean, who would you have liked in this matchup?
I think it would have been close. I think you've got to go with Montana State just based on, the season that they've had, and I think that they have the players that, when it's close at the very end, that they'll get it done. But let's not act like Montana State was like running through people in the tournament.
Right.
I mean, it was 2 5-point victories,
no doubt. Yep.
And they kind of struggled early on, especially. But we got to talk about Darian White a little. I mean, she's been the best player here, and if you had to guess who's going to be the MVP next year, I mean, I don't know if I'm not picking Darian White. She is so good.
Well, I would have picked her the MVP this year.
It is ridiculous. Like, she is so fun to watch, the way that, like, she gets up and down. And not only, like, you get the flashy offense where you're driving down and make a crazy left-handed lay-in while you're falling down, but defensively, like that play when she stole the ball from Nina Radford, he ripped it away from her and then went all the way down. Like, she
and a clutch moment too.
I mean, she's one of those players that you come across, in the Big Sky Conference every now and then, where they just like stand out and you're like, wow, that's not the type of player that is in this conference normally. And she's just amazing.
But you watch the women's league as much as anybody, actually, among the four of us this year, especially Montana State. I mean, what was your take on this, and how disappointing is this for that both these teams don't get a shot?
It really is disappointing. I agree with Sean so much that Montana State was not necessarily running through teams, but I think some real serious questions could have been answered in this game. Number one, Darian White was the freshman of the year in the Big Sky Conference, but was honorable mention All-League. And Idaho forward Beyonce Bay was second team All-League. A gal that was a freshman that was arguably the freshman of the year. That question really could have been answered, who is the better player, not in a matchup scenario, but in an overall, who's going to control their team's destiny. So I think Beyonce Bay won that first game for Idaho, as did Darian White the second game for Montana State. I love the matchup between Lizzie Klinker and Fallon Frigie. Two very senior-laden teams, but two girls who have battled their entire times at Idaho and Montana State.
And both basically North Dakotans, right? Because Fallon Frigie comes from Big Rock. I know Lizzie Klinker comes from Fairfield, which is Fairview, which is basically North Dakota, right?
We all talk so much about the Klinker sisters not playing in Montana, exiting the state to play their college basketball. It would have been such a good story for them to see what they do in their last game against the Montana team that they chose not to play for. I mean, I also really like the matchup of Darian White and Gina Markson. Gina Markson is a girl who was first team All-League, led the league in minutes, was third in scoring, led the league in three-point attempts, three-point makes, and three-point percentage. And Darian White would have had a whole lot to say about that with her defensive effort on one of the best guards in the league. I would have loved to see the matchup. I'm pretty heartbroken to not. The men's tournament didn't get as far as we would have liked it to, but the women's, we're on a real cliffhanger right here.
Fallon Frigie also is just so disappointing to me because her story is so unbelievable, and the way that she sort of got through this year and got integrated into the Montana State program after having really an awful experience at North Dakota. I mean, it was just really, really bad and hard for her all the way around for a bunch of different reasons, and then she found the thing that she had always hoped and dreamed that being on a collegiate team would be like with this Montana State club, and they were so good, and for her not to get to finish that out is really disappointing, though to have found what she was looking for the whole time is great, and it's okay, too, because in about 15 years she will be president, and so it's going to work out for Fallon Frigie, who is, one of the great leaders and minds that we've seen in Big Sky Conference basketball.
There's a lot of times where, student athletes will say, like, oh, man, this is the best team ever, I'm so happy, blah, blah, blah. And most of the time, it's just everybody saying that, right? When that's not actually the case. But with her, it was just completely genuine and evident. And that was the very first time that we did an interview with her as a TV station. She broke down crying in a TV interview, which doesn't happen often, especially when you're not comfortable with that person. It was the first time that she had ever done an interview with us, and she did it with Annika Cook, and she started crying, like mid-interview, about how special it is for her to be in Bozeman. And you would see it after every big play. She would go up to, Blair Braxton after that steal, and she gave her a big hug and was talking to her, doing it to Darian White. Like, the passion and how much enjoyment she was having this season was more evident than almost in any player that I've seen in the Big Sky Conference as of late. And for her not to have that one last game, you feel for her, man.
And also in her defense, the first time me, I cried. So, it does happen. It does happen. Let's talk about the men's tournament, shall we?
Well, and no doubt, I think that we turn the page to the men's tournament. I think that, like Sean was saying, a lot of these narratives are cliche and they get used a lot, but when they actually are authentic, they're great. Like, that narrative really is authentic. She really did find her dream school. She really did get to finally overcome just the horrific nature of her career and finish in a place that really means the world to her, like talking Fallon Frigie. But the men's narrative all year was that there's not an elite team in the league, but that it's a more balanced league, not necessarily because it's good, just because it's even, but that the tournament could be wild because it's going to all come down to matchup.
Wild.
And that narrative is used a lot of times, I think, by coaches because they want to pad their own selves. They want to have excuses for losses when they lose to the ninth place team. They want to say, well, the league's as deep as it's ever been. Everybody's good. Everybody can beat everybody on any given night. This year it was true, though. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so disappointing to me is you look at Montana State, they sneak into the 5th seed. But they're actually the team that's the most well-equipped to handle Portland State's pressure of any team in that top 5 because they have Harold Frey.
Right.
You look at Sac State. Sac State was up and down team and mostly down the second half of the conference season, but they have the physicality of the athletes, and they don't care about playing completely ugly. That could be so disruptive to a team like Eastern Washington that has so much pressure on them in the opening game. Montana, actually, I think probably had the easiest draw because they did get. I mean, we talked about it yesterday. Travis DeCuire was probably telling his guys, "Yo, we're going to get another shot at NAU." Right. Then they didn't. That would have been an interesting mental transition for the Grizz, but Idaho State's absolutely the best matchup in the league for the Grizz. They would have killed them. And in the final game, Northern Colorado and Southern Utah, talk about being haunted by demons. Southern Utah 20-pieced you in the tournament last year, knocked you out, ended Jordan Davis's career in the blink of an eye. I mean, that game was completely lopsided.
Yeah, and a complete shocker last year. I mean, everybody's looking around like, what is going on? And you wonder, okay, there's the retribution side of it for Northern Colorado, but also is there, like you said, the ghosts, right? Of right. Man, here comes the Giants from Southern Utah again, the 29-year-olds coming in to try and throw alley-oops all over the barn.
For me, it's just a shame because Eastern came in. It was their year to try and break through and do it. Montana State, Coach Sprinkle's first Big Sky Conference tournament. Yeah. We don't get to see that, and the fact that we don't get to see a Saeed Pridgett, Harold Frey, Jonah Radabaugh as seniors in this tournament, it sucks. It's a shame. And then we were going through like all four matchups, and you might go through each one of them individually. Yeah, the favorite might win. But when we were looking at it, we're like, I wouldn't be surprised if like two of these favorites go down. And it's just, it's a shame, but I mean, it is what it is.
I would have absolutely expected one. I don't know which one, but one to lose for sure, and then maybe two or more. It's that kind of thing. Bruce, what do you think about the men's tournament?
I thought that Idaho State definitely got the best of the entire tournament because they ended as the 11th seed on a win. Yeah. And I know that they're probably pretty stoked about that.
Right.
They're probably pretty stoked just to call this thing good.
There's one group of people that's like happy that this has happened.
Let's get on the bus. Let's go home. Let's reevaluate. Probably one of the only teams in the country that comes in as last seed as W. Doesn't have to play the Montana Grizzlies. As Coulter mentioned, a really bad matchup for them. But Mason Peatling is the kind of guy that wins tournament MVP that not everyone wants him to win it. Everyone says Jonah Radabaugh from Northern Colorado should be the tournament or the league MVP. The defensive player of the year multiple times in his career. Maybe it's Saeed Pridgett, but the Grizz lose 3 or 4 down the stretch. Right. And Mason Peatling, as Eastern Washington rises to the top, wins the regular season, becomes the regular season MVP, and there's some question marks about that. Now he doesn't get to affirm that in front of everybody.
Right.
So some of those kind of things, you really have it's tough to watch guys who have such good careers not get to affirm that in a national stage, but let alone in front of everyone on a neutral site where it really does matter.
The thing too is that if you follow, if you're in the state of Montana, especially in Missoula, okay, you watch the Grizz games. You've seen Eastern Washington and Northern Colorado twice. Who do you think's the better team if you're following Montana? Hands down, Northern Colorado. And that's the team that won twice and that looked great, and you couldn't really figure them out. And Eastern Washington got blown out and then handled. And Mason Peatling was like okay, but not great in those games. And in either case, Montana was good to go. But it doesn't give you an accurate portrayal of what Eastern Washington actually is, a 15-win basketball team.
Absolutely.
And 16. Were they 16 or 16? Yeah,
it's so hard to not say that the premier matchup of the tournament would have been Harold Frey and Holland Boo Boo Woods. Two first-team all-league guards who are going to play 40 minutes against each other.
Yeah.
One-on-one against each other.
One of their last games.
You'll see some hard hedges from both teams to push the ball out of those guys' hands, but those guys are going to put up shots. And we saw 2 35-point performances from Trayvon Allen at Idaho and Jarek Hardy at Weber State in losses. We would have seen another one in that game because both those guys are going to go for 30, at least try to, and one of those teams has to lose. We had a lot in front of us in this men's tournament that we did not get to see.
And so often, too, when we analyze this stuff, we look at programs that are doing it right. We look at narratives that are, wholesome is the wrong word, but appealing, worth rooting for, right? And the first 2 games of the men's tournament, the good story, the feel-good story would have been Jarek Harding scoring 35 points in a win, overcoming all the injuries that he's gone through all year, overcoming this catastrophic season that Weber State's had to go through. Not the Sac State team that completely went away from their identity, started worrying about scoring and not getting stops, and completely killed themselves because they don't have any shooters. Brian Katz said it. He said, we were what I wanted us to be until January 15th. Then we were a nightmare. because I built this team to not do anything but play defense. And we thought we were going to win games by scoring. And when we tried to score, we suck. He said, we're not trying to do that. Right. But then, like Randy Ray said after the game, he said, our whole game plan was that Sac State can't shoot. We were going to make the guys who can't shoot on Sac State shoot. Our game plan was perfect. They made shots for the first time all year. Congratulations to them. Sucks to be us. But it was just, it wasn't the wholesome narrative. It was a couple guys getting hot. I mean, good for those guys to step it up and performing. But those guys just played bully ball and just let Harding kind of get loose, and then his career goes down in a completely unclimactic fashion. And then you look at the Idaho game. Southern Utah is, I mean, let's be frank. Southern Utah does it worse than anybody in the league. It's the nightmare of every single team in the league because Southern Utah recruits the most talent. They put no priority on getting along. Todd Simon said in the press conference on the record, I got 9 starters. That's how we roll. We've heard from coaches across the league. That's why they don't have any chemistry. Because every single guy on the team, when they catch the ball, if there's a guy sitting on the scorer's table, they just shoot it because they're like, oh, he must be coming in for me. They got no continuity. But when they get to this tournament, they bust the bracket every time. That's not the wholesome storyline. The wholesome storyline would be Trayvon Allen, the last man standing at Idaho, sticking around through the coaching change, going off in front of a crowd that was, I mean, he had, how many people were in the crowd yesterday? 50 for him? Just for him. I mean, his whole family was there. That would have been the feel-good storyline. And so that's what's so disappointing to me. And then NAU, their improvements, they fall flat against Idaho State. Good for Idaho State. You know, Ryan Mooney gets a win in the tournament in his first year with almost a completely brand-new roster. But each of the, what we would say were the great storylines, the things that we would want to promote and really affirm in our analysis, they all fell flat. And then we don't get to see all the ones that would have been guaranteed good storylines. There wouldn't have been a bad storyline out of Portland State, Montana State. There's no bad storyline out of the Grizz trying to defend their championship. Those are all good storylines, and we don't even get to see it. So from our perspective, incredibly disappointing.
The irony of all that, though, in the way that this played out, is that there is a finality that Allen and Harding get to have that nobody else does. And even though it wasn't a loss, you can at least say, you know what, I got to the end. It wasn't where I wanted the end to be, but I didn't make it there. Everybody else is sitting here going, well, we would have. You know, there's not a team. There's not a team left. Even Idaho State, maybe, that goes, well, we were going to win. We were going to beat the Grizz today. You know, if you have the right attitude, everybody believes that to be the case of what we would have done and what we were built to do, and we had it rolling at the right time or whatever. And that's the stuff that you don't get to see, and that's a disappointing thing. But at least they finished their careers in a certain sense.
Well, here's a wild thought that I want to throw out to you guys, and you guys tell me what you think, because it's been a wild day. So let's just keep it going here. Oklahoma State head coach said that the seniors should be given another year of eligibility. How crazy would that be? And is that, I mean, it sounds a little much maybe, but like, is that something that like they should be thinking about? Because I mean, when we're talking about spring sports are canceled, so those kids are going to have to get one.
Right.
But I mean, if you're talking about seniors, and especially if they didn't play at all in their conference tournament and the NCAA tournament, and that's you. I mean, you could make a case that you could give seniors another year, which would be wild.
What do you think of that, Brooks? I don't think that'll happen, and that's really unfortunate. I think it's a lot like the new redshirt rule in football. I think that there's too many games played. The eligibility's burned. I wish that happened. I personally think that it should. I don't think that there's really any chance it will, especially because now, is there a conference among the 32 conferences that aren't neutral site? Everybody gets a bid.
I think the Ivy League might be still like a non-neutral site.
Safe to say, regardless of the fact-checking of it, safe to say that the vast majority of Division I conferences in the country have neutral site tournaments, and almost every single one of those neutral site tournaments invite every member of the league to the tournament. We could debate the merits and downfalls of that as much as we want, but the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, I can criticize Southern Utah all I want. But how many games you win at the neutral site tournament is actually all that matters.
Totally.
If you get to the semifinals every year, you're going to have a job as a coach forever. And the only thing that really matters is winning 3 to 4 games 1 week in March. So throw out all the records and all that kind of stuff, any individual accolades, any of that stuff. Flush it. I think they should get another go-around because at the end of the day, they were all playing for this exact moment. Yeah, you're recruiting the balance of scholarships that guys you've already committed to. You have a 15-man roster where 4 guys leave and you can't bring 4 guys back. I don't think it works. Oh, and then also that it comes down to the statistics. Obviously, you're not going to make decisions based on statistics, but if Jarek Harding gets another year, he already has 2,300 points. And if he gets healthy next year, he might go score 700
Jared Hardy that many balls.
That's what I'm saying. Like, this guy might finish his career with 3,000 points if he gets another year to play.
But, like, their season ended, though. So, like, does Jared Harding not get another year?
Right.
But the guys that didn't get to play in the conference tournament, they would. It would. I don't think it is going to happen, but it was just an interesting thing that I thrown out there and figured might as well throw it out there with all the craziness that's been going on.
We'll take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll wrap up the show and maybe try and think of some other ways to right the wrongs that are going on in the world. We can't solve the coronavirus issue. We don't have the skill set in this room, but my goodness, if we can't pacify the sports people, we'll try and do that right after this. Hey, Stockman's Bank invites you to experience the Stockman difference. As a family-owned community bank with locations throughout Montana, Stockman Bank is committed to enriching the lives of Montanans and helping communities succeed. What that means is your money stays in the local economy, supporting your friends and neighbors. When you bank with Stockman, you receive personalized customer service, and your phone call is answered by a live person. Imagine that. Their highly skilled and personable bank staff is dedicated to making it easy to transfer your accounts and meeting your overall financial needs. Blending traditional Western values with modern conveniences and state-of-the-art technology, they provide time-tested products and services from people who truly care about you and your financial success. As Montana's brand of banking, Stockman Bank is proud to sponsor the Grizzly Athletics and the University of Montana, and thanks to all of the players for your hard work and dedication. Go Grizz! Stockman Bank, Montana's brand of banking, member FDIC.
Are you looking for a checking account that is easy to understand and easy to use? Then Stockman Bank's 406 checking account is for you, offering free online and mobile banking and a free Visa check card. You can access your account anytime, anywhere. Stop by any of our 35 locations statewide and open your account today. $100 minimum opening deposit required. Stockman Bank, Montana's brand of banking, member FDIC.
Get March markdowns at Carl Tyler Chevrolet. Right now, save big on this 2019 Blazer all-wheel drive with leather interior, power panoramic sunroof, navigation, and Bose audio. Now $5,800 off. Or take advantage of $4,900 off this 2019 Trax LT all-wheel drive. Visit us today at 3663 North Reserve Street or gmofmontana.com. Carl Tyler Chevrolet. Find new roads.
Now, the Montana Club's happy hour features BOGO beverages. Our expertly mixed cocktails, microbrews, domestics, and wine are buy one, get one free 7 days a week from 3 to 5:30. Stop in on Friday for Montini night. Sip on a top shelf martini for only $6, 5:30 to close. When you've worked hard all day and are ready to relax, the Montana Club has got you covered with BOGO happy hour 7 days a week, 3 to 5:30 on Brooks and North Reserve, Missoula.
The Advocates want you to remember that warmer weather means more people will be out and about. Remember, slow down in residential areas. Kids will be out riding their bikes and their scooters or walking their dogs, so pay attention to the road. If you are injured due to someone else's negligence, the Advocates can help. Speak with an experienced attorney today for free. The Advocates will handle the hassle after an accident so you can focus on getting better. So call 640-4444 or chat with an attorney online 24/7 at MontanaAdvocates.com. You deserve an advocate.
For more than 40 years, Boyle, Devney & Meyer has been among the most trusted accounting firms in the state of Montana. Boyle, Devney & Meyer is an experienced, diverse accounting firm rooted in historical Missoula with a look toward the future. They've established a reputation for excellence, teamwork, and community involvement. Whether you're a small business that needs tax assistance or you are a nonprofit or an individual looking for a personal, comprehensive financial plan, Boyle, Devney & Meyer can help. Give Boyle, Devney & Meyer a call today, 721-3555, or visit bbmcpa.com. Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast is out now. Interviews with every living head coach in the history of the University of Montana men's basketball team.
If you're a basketball fan, you're going to love this. If you're a Grizz fan, you're going to love this. But if you're a Missoulian, you're going to love this as well. One of the greatest parts about living in the state of Montana is how steeped in history it is, and this is a historical archiving of one of the proudest lineages our community has to offer.
Grizz Greats, the Coaching Tree podcast, out now wherever you get your podcasts. Available thanks to Blackfoot Communications, Stockman's Bar, and Berkshire Hathaway Real Estate.
Tutel and Nuanez on 102.9 ESPN Radio for Missoula.
back. Now in Nuanez and Nuanez and Rainey on your radio, on your televisions across the state, SWX Montana, ESPN. We appreciate you letting us be with you. If you missed anything in the first hour or now 2 of the show, check it out on the podcast. The You Tell Nuanez podcast, available wherever you get your podcast. Rate, review, download, subscribe. Appreciate all of that. It's available thanks to Wingate by Wyndham Hotel and Blackfoot Communications. And Brooks, as we wrap things up here from Boise, Idaho, from our makeshift studio in the hotel, the Grove Hotel, I know that you've got some thoughts, in terms of a couple of points about teams that trim nuts down and that ultimately are conference champions.
Yeah, I mean, as we went to break, I just thought so much about the rivalry between Eastern Washington and Montana. In the men's side, Shante Leggins and Travis DeCuire have had words on court, off court, in press conferences. There's clearly a rivalry there that I think is healthy and positive for the league.
Yeah.
I think that Eastern Washington right now can stand with their heads pretty tall. They have the MVP of the league. At home, they got to cut nets down, and there was confetti flying, and the music was playing, and they never had to come to this tournament and bounce the basketball one single time. Going into next season, I think that gives you a little bit of confidence. I think it gives Eastern Washington a leg up on a Montana team that we mentioned lost 3 or 4 down the stretch. A guy like Saeed Pridgett, someone that we've been so lucky to watch, especially there in Missoula at Dahlberg, being such a dominant player, especially this year, but throughout his entire career. I think the 4th all-time leading scorer in Montana history, losing 3 of 4 down the stretch, including to Southern Utah on his senior night. That burns. I think that Mason Peatling sitting in his hotel room right now is like, well, I had a pretty good season.
Yeah. Let me ask you this.
And you don't have to end your career with, let's make no mistake, especially the Grizz the last 2 years, those guys had lofty expectations. They got their hearts ripped out the instant they turned it.
Absolutely.
But they were devastated. Because it wasn't just that you lost, and it wasn't like you lost in heartbreaking fashion. You got destroyed. That's a tough way for your career to end.
Tough, especially if you score. Guys like Ahmad Rory and Michael Ogine, going out on single-digit performances and not even getting to 45 points in either game. And, those are hard losses to take.
You went to school with Will Cherry. Will Cherry played the worst game of his entire basketball career. Did he ever played in his life against Syracuse?
He made one shot.
What a horrible memory for your last game. Yeah, but, Mason Peatling gets to remember cutting down the nets on senior night. The thing is, though, is that you played a last game that you knew it was the last game. That's the difference. He did trim the nets, but it was like you went in the locker room, you're like, okay, this is all well and good, but this ain't what we're here for. Let's go.
Well, that's a good point you made about Trayvon Allen. Trayvon Allen stood in the middle of the Century League Arena after the game was over, and he just looked up at everybody. And I thought he was going to cry. He didn't. He smiled. And at the press conference, I said, Trayvon, what's your emotions right now? And he said, it's tough, but it's not that tough because I stayed true to myself, I stayed true to my school, I stayed true to my family, and I played my absolute hardest, and I played one of my best games of my career in my last game. So it's hard to think that it's over, but I feel pretty good about the way that I went out as a Vandal. Even if it was, a 4-win season, I feel pretty good about me. And, you don't want to make it selfish, but when a guy's been that unselfish for the last couple of years and just bit the bullet and taken the losses, yeah. He can be selfish in that moment because in that moment it is just about him.
Brooks, let me ask you, though, you mentioned that about, the Eastern Washington-Montana rivalry in basketball and kind of where that ends up now. One of the things that Travis DeCuire seems to do really well is manufacture or build on, if it's true, motivations from either slights or from teams that they've lost to before, things like that. How much do you think in this offseason, the next time the Grizzlies play Eastern Washington, that this becomes a central point of what he will preach to his team about, don't talk to me about conference championships and everything that went down. We knew, what was going to happen in Boise and all that kind of stuff, and uses that as a platform to sort of get his team up for games against Eastern next season.
I think that's exactly my point, is on both sides. I think that Shante Leggins would, as we know him, is such a competitive guy.
Yeah, he is.
Love to play this tournament. But he gets to stand here uncontested as the Big Sky Conference Coach of the Year.
Right.
And there is no loss in a championship where Travis DeCuire can flex on him a little bit and say, you remember who the real Coach of the Year is. That doesn't get to happen. And next year, I think Shante will use that as motivation. He's a different style of motivator than Travis is.
For sure.
Across the board, I think at every single level. But Travis will use this in such a different level of motivation. We saw how that game ended in Missoula.
Yeah.
There was plenty of fire. There was plenty of heat from both sides.
Right.
And I think that there will be continuing to be that. I think that next year, the first game, as well as the second game, will have a little bit more of a championship-style environment.
No doubt.
Tutel Nuanez, 102.9 ESPN Radio. What a day. What a bizarre and crazy day that it's been for waking up, hoping for games, thinking that they're not really going to do this, then they did this, and then you sit here and you kind of look around and go, okay, well, what now? But we hope for the last couple of hours we could fill a little bit of the what now. We will see what we're able to pull off for tomorrow. If we can figure out how to get back on the air, we certainly will be. We appreciate Tommy and David for all their efforts on the other side to get us on the air today. We appreciate that. And I appreciate Sean Rainey and Brooks Nuanez for being here, guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with us here this afternoon. As always, absolutely, thanks, guys. Boys and girls, out there in Montana, same spot for us. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you tomorrow.
Tell me your blue skies fade to gray. Tell me your passion's gone away, and I don't need no carrying on. You're standing alive just to hit a new low. You're faking a smile with the coffee go. And tell me your life's been way offline. You fall into pieces every time, and I don't need no carrying on. 'Cause you had a bad day, you take one.
Are you looking for a checking account that is easy to understand and easy to use? Then Stockman Bank's 406 checking account is for you, offering free online and mobile banking and a free Visa check card. You can access your account anytime, anywhere. Stop by any of our 35 locations statewide.